The eviction notice was taped to the apartment door when Jack Brennan returned from his third rejected job interview that week, the pink paper stark against faded wood, a bureaucratic death sentence that gave him and his 7-year-old twin daughters exactly 14 days to find somewhere else to live. He stood in the hallway holding grocery bags filled with the cheapest food he could afford, doing math in his head that wouldn't work no matter how many times he recalculated. $412 in his account, 2 weeks until they were on the street, and absolutely nowhere to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the apartment, his daughters Emma and Grace were doing homework at the kitchen table they'd salvaged from a curb 3 months ago, their identical faces showing the careful concentration of children who'd learned not to ask questions when their father came home looking defeated. They were too young to understand the full weight of their circumstances, but old enough to know that something had broken when their mother died 2 years ago, that the life they'd known had shattered into pieces Jack was failing to put back together. "Dad, Mrs. Chen says we need to bring $20 for the field trip next week," Emma said, not looking up from her math worksheet. Jack set down the groceries, crumpling the eviction notice before the girls could see it. "We'll figure it out, sweetheart." But he wouldn't figure it out. He'd been barely holding together since losing his job at the grain elevator 6 months ago, since the medical bills from Sarah's cancer had consumed every dollar they'd saved and then some. The apartment was already 2 months behind on rent, and the landlord had been patient longer than Jack had any right to expect. 14 days was mercy, not cruelty, though it felt like both. That night, after the girls fell asleep in the bedroom they shared, Jack sat at the kitchen table searching rental listings he couldn't afford on a laptop held together with electrical tape. The cheapest apartment he could find was $800 a month, and that required first month, last month, and security deposit, money that might as well have been on the moon for all his ability to access it. He was about to close the browser when an email notification appeared. "County foreclosure auction, tomorrow at 10 a.m., commercial properties starting at minimum bids as low as $400. Jack clicked through more out of desperation than hope, finding a list of buildings the county had seized for unpaid taxes, structures so damaged or contaminated or legally complicated that nobody wanted them. One property caught his eye. Riverside Malt House, established 1891, located in Timber Ridge. 2, 7 acres including main malting building, grain silos, and processing equipment. Minimum bid $450. Property sold as is, buyer assumes all liens and environmental obligations. The photographs showed a massive brick building that looked like it had been slowly collapsing for decades, its windows either broken or boarded, its roof sagging in sections that suggested serious structural damage. According to the county assessor's notes, the Malt House had closed in 1982 when the last owner died, had sat abandoned since then accumulating tax debt and environmental citations for asbestos and lead paint. It was madness to even consider it. But $450 was less than 1 month's rent, and a building with a roof was better than sleeping in the truck Jack no longer owned because he'd sold it last month for grocery money. He spent 2 hours researching Timber Ridge, finding it was a small town about 90 miles away, a place that had thrived when local breweries needed locally malted barley and had slowly died when industrial maltsters made small operations obsolete. The Riverside Malt House had been owned by the Keller family for 3 generations, had specialized in premium malted barley for craft breweries and distilleries. The last Keller to run it had been a man named Henry, who'd inherited the operation from his father and had tried to keep it viable through the 60s and 70s by focusing on quality over volume. One newspaper article from 1982 described Henry's death as sudden and mysterious, found in the Malt House under circumstances that raised questions never fully answered. The operation had closed immediately, and the property had bounced through several failed development attempts before the county seized it. Jack made his decision at 3 in the morning, lying awake in the living room while his daughters slept in the next room. He'd take the girls to school, drive to the auction in a borrowed car, and bid on a building he'd never seen in a town he'd never visited. It was desperation masquerading as strategy, but desperation was all he had left. The auction took place in the Timber Ridge Courthouse, a building that looked like it had been important once and was now just hanging on. Maybe 8 people sat scattered across folding chairs, most of them looking like investors or scrappers hoping to pick up metal from industrial buildings. Jack sat in the back, having dropped the girls at school with promises to pick them up on time, aware that he was about to gamble money he couldn't afford to lose. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The auctioneer worked through properties with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, selling vacant lots and condemned houses to buyers who knew exactly what they were acquiring. When the Riverside Malt House came up, his tone shifted to warning. Property requires extensive remediation for asbestos and lead paint. Structure is unsafe for occupation without major repairs. Buyer assumes all environmental liens and cleanup costs. County makes no representations about structural integrity. Minimum bid $450. Jack raised his hand, his heart hammering so hard it felt like everyone in the room could hear it. $450 from bidder 12. Do I hear $475? Silence filled the courthouse. Jack could feel attention turning toward him, could sense people wondering what kind of fool bid on a building with those kinds of problems. Going once at $450. The auctioneer scanned the room. Going twice. Jack waited for reality to intervene, for someone to save him from his own desperation. Sold to bidder 12 for $450. At the clerk's window, he counted out $450 in 20s and 10s, then added 35 more for fees and processing. The clerk, a woman named Dorothy who looked like she'd been working there since the building was new, slid the deed across the counter with an expression that mixed sympathy and concern. The Keller place, she said. Yes, ma'am. My father worked there in the 60s. Said Henry Keller was particular about quality, ran a tight operation. Place had a reputation though. What kind of reputation? Dorothy leaned forward slightly. Henry was secretive about certain parts of the process, kept areas of the malt house locked that workers weren't allowed in. Some folks thought he was doing something illegal, maybe moonshining on the side. Others figured he just protected trade secrets. She tapped the deed. After he died, there were rumors he'd hidden something valuable. People broke in over the years looking for it, never found anything but old equipment and mold. The drive to Timber Ridge took Jack through countryside that showed the same slow decline as the town itself. Farms that had once been prosperous now sat partially abandoned, barns collapsing under their own weight, fields growing wild with whatever chose to seed there. The malt house sat at the edge of Timber Ridge where River Road curved to follow the Clearwater River, a massive industrial structure that dominated the landscape. From a distance, it looked almost impressive, a testament to an era when buildings were made to last. Up close, the decay was unmistakable. Broken windows, graffiti on the lower walls, sections of brick facing that had begun to separate from the structure. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the property, its gate hanging open, padlock long since cut away. Jack parked the borrowed car in the gravel lot where delivery trucks had once loaded malted barley, looking at what he'd purchased with money that should have gone toward keeping them housed. The decision felt insane in daylight, felt like the kind of choice made by someone who'd given up on conventional solutions and was just throwing dice hoping something would land right. He approached the main entrance carefully, stepping over broken glass and around equipment that had been left to rust where it stood. The door was secured with a newer-looking padlock, and the key Dorothy had given him turned smoothly despite the building's general decay. Inside, the malt house was vast and overwhelming. The main floor stretched out like a cathedral to industrial process, 3 stories of open space beneath a ceiling supported by iron beams and timber trusses. Massive grain bins stood in rows, the vessels where barley had been soaked and germinated and dried. Conveyor systems and processing equipment filled the space, machinery whose purpose Jack could only guess at. The smell hit him immediately, a complex mixture of old grain and mildew and something organic that had been soaking into the building's bones for decades. Not unpleasant exactly, but deeply unfamiliar, the scent of processes and materials most people had forgotten existed. Light filtered through broken windows and gaps in the roof, illuminating dust that danced in the air. Jack stood in the center of the main floor trying to process what he'd committed them to, aware that this building needed hundreds of thousands of dollars in repairs before it would be remotely habitable, money he didn't have and couldn't imagine acquiring. Stairs led to upper levels, metal structures that Jack tested carefully before climbing. The second floor held what appeared to be administrative offices and quality control rooms, spaces where the business side of malting had happened while the processing work went on below. Most rooms were empty except for water damage and debris. One office was larger than the others, with windows overlooking the processing floor. A desk remained, its surface warped by moisture but still intact. Filing cabinets lined one wall, most hanging open and empty. A framed photograph hung askew, showing a stern-looking man in work clothes standing in front of the malt house in what must have been the 1970s. Jack studied the photograph, recognizing this must be Henry Keller. He had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades working with grain and machinery, his expression serious, his posture suggesting pride in his operation. Behind him in the photograph, barely visible, was something that caught Jack's attention, a door that he didn't see anywhere on the current walls. He turned to examine the actual office, finding the walls covered with old safety notices and production schedules pinned to cork boards that had begun to crumble. When he pulled down one section of notices, he found it, a door frame that had been boarded over and then covered so thoroughly it looked like solid wall. Jack's pulse quickened. This wasn't casual boarding up. This was deliberate concealment, the kind of thing done by someone who wanted to make sure a door was forgotten entirely. He used his pocket knife to pry away some of the covering, finding beneath it a heavy wooden door with an industrial lock. The keys Dorothy had given him included several that looked original to the building. The third key fit the lock, turning with resistance that suggested decades without use. Jack pulled the door open carefully, revealing darkness and a narrow staircase descending into the building's foundation. Cold air rose from below, carrying a smell different from the malt house's grain residue. Something metallic and clean, like air that had been sealed away from the decay happening in the rest of the building. Jack pulled out his phone, turning on its flashlight. The beam revealed stone steps leading down approximately 20 feet before opening into what appeared to be a larger space. Jack descended slowly, each step feeling like commitment to something he didn't fully understand. The stairs ended in a chamber maybe 30 feet square, the walls lined with brick, the ceiling supported by stone arches. Unlike the malt house above, this space showed no signs of water damage or decay. It had been sealed so completely that time had barely touched it. Metal shelving lined the walls, holding hundreds of ledgers labeled with dates spanning from 1891 through 1982. But what occupied the center of the chamber made Jack's breath catch. A massive iron safe sat on a platform of concrete blocks, maybe 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide. The safe showed signs of careful maintenance, its surface oiled and preserved despite the decades since Henry Keller's death. A brass plate was mounted on its front, engraved with words Jack had to lean close to read in his phone's light. Henry Keller, Master Maltster. Quality endures when profit fades. Jack stood in the hidden chamber holding his phone, its beam catching details that suggested this space had been prepared deliberately, maintained carefully, sealed with purpose. He thought about Dorothy's words, rumors of hidden treasure, people searching and finding nothing. Because they'd been looking in obvious places, not for doors that had been concealed so thoroughly that 40 years had nearly erased them. He examined the safe more closely, finding it had both a combination lock and a keyhole. None of his keys seemed to match, and he had no combination. But tucked into a gap between the safe and the wall, he found something, a leather-bound journal, newer looking than the ledgers on the shelves, with a folded note inside its cover. Jack opened the note carefully, finding handwritten instructions in fading ink. The combination is the year malting began here, followed by my birth year. The key is hidden where the best barley grows, beneath the hop vine that has climbed longest. If you found this chamber, you've earned what it holds. Use it to build something that lasts. Henry Keller, March 1982. Jack stood in the darkness holding a note written by a dead man, looking at a safe that might contain nothing or might contain something that changed everything, feeling the weight of discovery settle onto shoulders already carrying more than they could bear. Above him, the malt house creaked in the wind, its vast spaces holding secrets Henry Keller had died protecting. The building Jack had purchased for $485 of money he desperately needed had just revealed itself to be something far more complicated than an abandoned industrial ruin. And whatever waited in that safe, whatever Henry Keller had sealed away weeks before his mysterious death, was about to become Jack's burden or salvation or both. Jack's first instinct was to search for the hop vine immediately, but practical reality intervened. He had to pick up Emma and Grace from school, had to explain somehow where they were going to live now that the eviction deadline loomed. The safe and its secrets would have to wait until he'd figured out how to tell his 7-year-old daughters that their home for the foreseeable future would be a condemned industrial building 90 miles from everything they knew. He made the drive back in borrowed time, his mind cycling through the implications of what he'd found. Henry Keller had hidden something valuable enough to warrant an elaborate concealment, had died shortly after sealing the chamber, had left instructions suggesting he'd expected someone to eventually find it. The timing felt significant. Henry had written the note in March 1982, and the newspaper article about his death was dated April of the same year. Emma and Grace were waiting with their backpacks when Jack pulled up, their faces showing relief that he'd arrived on time despite their growing familiarity with broken promises. They climbed into the borrowed car with the careful silence of children who'd learned to read their father's moods, waiting to see if this was a day for conversation or quiet. "We need to talk about something," Jack said once they were away from the school. "The apartment, we can't stay there anymore. The landlord needs us to move out." "Are we going to be homeless?" Grace asked, her voice small but direct. She was the more practical twin, the one who stated hard truths while Emma tried to find hope in bad situations. "No. I bought us a building today. It needs a lot of work, but it's ours and nobody can make us leave." "What kind of building?" Emma's optimism was already searching for the positive angle, for the adventure rather than the hardship. "An old malt house. It's where they used to process barley for breweries. It's big and mostly empty, but there's space for us and it has a roof." The girls processed this with the adaptability that had gotten them through their mother's death and the slow unraveling of stability that followed. They asked practical questions about bathrooms and where they'd sleep, about whether they'd have to change schools, about what a malt house was and why someone would abandon such a big building. Jack answered honestly, not sugarcoating the challenges but also not overwhelming them with the full weight of what he'd committed them to. They'd spend tonight packing what they owned, tomorrow moving to Timber Ridge, and the weekend making the malt house livable enough to meet basic needs. That evening, while the girls sorted through belongings and decided what to keep, Jack researched the malt house's history more thoroughly. He found Henry Keller's obituary, which listed his birth year as 1918. Combined with the founding year of 1891, that gave him a combination, 1891 to 1918. But he still needed the key Henry had mentioned, hidden beneath a hop vine. The next morning, they loaded everything they owned into the borrowed car and a rental trailer Jack could barely afford. The girls sat quietly during the drive to Timber Ridge, watching familiar landscape give way to unfamiliar countryside, processing the fact that this move was permanent, that the life they'd known was being left behind. The malt house looked even more imposing when Jack pulled into the gravel lot with his daughters, its industrial bulk dominating the landscape. Emma and Grace stared up at the building with expressions that mixed awe and uncertainty. "It's really big," Emma said. "And really broken," Grace added, her practical nature noting the obvious problems. They spent the day making one section of the second floor habitable, using camping equipment and cleaning supplies to create a space that was safe enough for sleeping. Jack focused on a corner office that had the least water damage, sweeping out debris and setting up sleeping bags while the girls explored under strict instructions not to touch anything dangerous. By evening they had a makeshift camp, sleeping bags arranged near the camping stove, bottled water for drinking, sandwiches for dinner because there was no way to cook properly yet. It wasn't comfortable, wasn't what any child deserved, but it was shelter and it was theirs. After the girls fell asleep, Jack searched the property by flashlight, looking for hop vines. Hops were traditionally grown near breweries and malt houses, used in beer making, and would have been part of the facility's ecosystem. He found them along the fence line near the river, several plants that had grown wild over 40 years of neglect. One vine was substantially larger than the others, its base maybe 4 inches in diameter, climbing a metal trellis structure that had probably been installed decades ago. Jack knelt beside it, using his flashlight to examine the soil around its base. About a foot from the main stem, he found disturbed earth, a section that looked like it had been dug and refilled at some point. He used a trowel from the camping supplies to dig carefully, finding about 8 inches down a small metal box sealed with tar that had cracked with age but had apparently done its job. Inside was a key wrapped in oilcloth, perfectly preserved after 40 years in the ground. Jack sat back on his heels holding the key, looking at the malt house silhouetted against the night sky, feeling the weight of what came next. Opening the safe meant discovering whether Henry Keller had left valuable treasure or just sentimental items, whether Jack's desperate gamble would pay off or whether he'd simply acquired another burden. He waited until morning, until the girls were awake and eating breakfast, before descending to the hidden chamber. They insisted on coming with him, their curiosity overriding any fear of the dark basement or sealed room. Jack led them down carefully, his flashlight illuminating the chamber that had been waiting since 1982. "Whoa," Emma breathed, seeing the safe and the shelves of ledgers. "Is that a treasure chest?" Grace asked, her practical tone not quite masking excitement. "I don't know yet," Jack said honestly. "But we're about to find out." He turned the safe's combination dial carefully. Right to 18, left to 91, right to 19, left to 18. The mechanism clicked with surprising smoothness, suggesting Henry had maintained it even as the malt house decayed around his secret chamber. Jack inserted the key, and it turned with the same precise engineering. The safe door swung open heavily, revealing contents that made Jack's hands start shaking. Not gold coins or jewelry or the kind of dramatic treasure he'd half expected. Instead, the safe held stacked bills, old $100 bills bound with paper bands, each bundle marked with Henry Keller's handwriting noting amounts and dates. Jack pulled out one bundle with trembling fingers, counting 50 bills bound together. The note read 1982 final liquidation. He started counting bundles, his mind struggling with mathematics that seemed impossible. 50 bills per bundle, stacked in careful rows that filled the safe's interior. Emma and Grace watched with wide eyes as their father counted, understanding even at 7 that they were looking at more money than they'd ever seen. Jack lost count twice and had to start over, his heart hammering, sweat forming despite the cool basement air. When he finished counting, the number seemed impossible. $650,000, give or take. Henry Keller had converted his entire operation to cash before his death, had hidden it in this chamber, and had died without telling anyone where it was. For 40 years, more than $500,000 had sat beneath a building nobody wanted, waiting for someone desperate enough to buy a condemned malt house at auction. "Dad?" Emma's voice was small. "Is that a lot of money?" "Yes, sweetheart. That's enough money to change everything." Jack sat on the cold stone floor with his daughters, surrounded by more wealth than he'd earned in 20 years of honest work, trying to process what this meant. They could pay off Sarah's medical debts. Could buy a real house. Could give the girls the kind of security and opportunity he'd been failing to provide since losing his job. But even as relief flooded through him, warning bells were ringing. Henry Keller had hidden this money elaborately, had died shortly after sealing the chamber. The newspaper article had mentioned mysterious circumstances, questions never fully answered. People had searched the malt house for years, had known or suspected something valuable was hidden here. Jack spent the rest of the day in the chamber, photographing everything, reading through Henry's ledgers to understand what had happened. The story that emerged was of a master maltster who'd seen his industry changing, who'd liquidated his operation methodically over several years, converting equipment and inventory to cash. The ledgers from 1978 to 1982 showed Henry selling off machinery, paying final wages to employees, settling debts, and systematically dismantling a business his grandfather had started. The final entry, dated March 15, 1982, simply read, "The work ends. The provision continues. May it serve someone who understands quality over profit." They were eating a makeshift dinner in their camping space when Jack heard a vehicle pull into the gravel lot. He moved to the window, seeing a new truck, 2 men getting out. His instinct said this wasn't a friendly visit. The men approached the building's entrance, and Jack went down to meet them before they could try forcing their way in. They were both around 60, wearing work clothes that were too clean, their posture suggesting they weren't used to being told no. "You're the one who bought this place," the older man said. "Not a question." "I am. Name's Richard Stokes. This is my brother Martin. Our family has history with this property. We're here to make you an offer." Jack kept his expression neutral. "I just bought it yesterday. Haven't even assessed what I'm dealing with yet. That's why we're here. Save you some trouble." Richard pulled out a folded document. $35,000, transfer within 3 weeks. You walk away with a profit and don't have to deal with asbestos remediation or structural problems. $35,000 would have been life-changing money a week ago. Now, knowing what was hidden in the basement, it was an insult. But more importantly, the timing was suspicious. These men had been waiting for someone to buy the Malt house, had come prepared with an offer that suggested they knew or suspected what the building contained. "Why do you want it?" Jack asked. "Family connection. The Stokes family worked for Henry Keller for 3 generations. When he died and the place closed, we lost our livelihood. We've been trying to acquire it ever since, make something productive out of what he let rot." Martin spoke up, his voice carrying an edge his brothers didn't. Henry Keller was difficult to work for. Secretive, suspicious, treated his employees like they were trying to steal from him. When he died, he took everything with him, didn't leave anything for the people who'd made his business successful. Jack heard the resentment beneath the words, the anger of people who felt they'd been cheated. "If your family worked here, you'd know the environmental problems. Why offer $35,000 for a property that needs hundreds of thousands in cleanup? We've got experience with remediation. Resources to handle it properly." Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Look, we're making a fair offer. The property has significant liabilities. You're in over your head, and we're giving you an easy out. I need time to think about it." "You've got 48 hours, Martin said flatly. "After that, things get more complicated. Small towns have ways of making life difficult for outsiders who don't cooperate." After they left, Jack stood in the gravel lot feeling the familiar weight of threat and pressure, recognizing the pattern from every other time someone with resources wanted something from someone without them. The Stokes family knew or suspected Henry had hidden money. They'd been waiting 40 years to acquire the property, had probably pressured previous buyers the same way. He climbed back to the office where Emma and Grace were drawing pictures by flashlight, their faces showing the careful attention they gave activities that distracted from uncertainty. Jack sat with them, trying to figure out how to protect what they'd found without putting his daughters at risk. "Those men want to buy our building," Grace said, having clearly been listening from the window. "They do. Are you going to sell it?" Jack thought about the question, about the money that could solve every immediate problem, about the threats implicit in Martin's words, about Henry Keller dying mysteriously weeks after hiding a fortune. "I don't think so. But I need to be smart about how we handle this." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay in the sleeping bag listening to his daughters breathe, thinking about Dorothy's words at the courthouse, rumors of hidden treasure, Henry's mysterious death, people searching for decades without finding anything. The Stokes family had worked here, had been positioned to know if Henry was hiding something, had lost their jobs when the Malt house closed. Around 3 a.m., Jack heard sounds outside. Not a vehicle approaching but something quieter, more furtive. He slipped out of the sleeping bag and moved to the window, seeing flashlight beams moving around the property's perimeter. Someone was searching, examining the building's exterior, looking for ways in. Jack grabbed his phone and started recording, documenting whoever was out there. The figure moved methodically, checking doors and windows, testing the fence line. After maybe 20 minutes, they left, disappearing into darkness beyond the property. The next morning, Jack drove to the county sheriff's office, filing a report about the trespassing and the Stokes brothers' implied threats. The deputy who took the report was young, professional, and clearly skeptical. "The Stokes family has been in Timber Ridge for generations," the deputy said. "They're respected members of the community. You sure you didn't misinterpret what they said? I'm sure they threatened to make life difficult if I don't sell. And someone was trespassing on my property last night. Did you see who it was?" "Not clearly enough to identify them." The deputy's expression said this was going nowhere. "I'll file the report. We'll increase patrols. But Mr. Brennan, you're new here. Small towns can be complicated for outsiders. Sometimes cooperating with established families makes life easier." Jack left the sheriff's office understanding he was on his own, that the Stokes family had influence he couldn't match, that protecting what he'd found would require more than legal channels. He drove to the county clerk's office, finding Dorothy and asking about the Stokes family's history. "Richard and Martin's grandfather worked for Henry's father," Dorothy explained. "Their father became Henry's foreman in the 60s. The family felt entitled to inherit the business when Henry died, but his will left everything to distant cousins who sold to a development company. The Stokes family has been trying to acquire the property ever since." "Did they know Henry well? Would they know if he'd hidden something valuable?" Dorothy's pause was telling. There were always tensions. Henry was brilliant at malting but difficult personally. Trusted no one, kept parts of the operation locked away from his own employees. When he died, the Stokes family claimed he'd promised them right of first refusal on the business, but nothing was in writing. They've carried that grudge for 40 years. After leaving Dorothy's office, Jack sat in the borrowed car thinking about inherited anger, about families who'd spent decades fighting over what they believed was stolen from them. The pattern was familiar from the stories he'd heard about small-town conflicts, grievances that became identity, that passed from generation to generation until nobody remembered if the original wrong was even real. He drove back to the Malt house, finding Emma and Grace playing in the gravel lot, their laughter echoing off brick walls that had seen better days. They'd adapted with the flexibility of children, had turned this abandoned industrial site into an adventure despite its obvious problems. Jack watched them, feeling the weight of the choice he was making. Keeping the money meant fighting people who'd been waiting 40 years to get what they believed Henry Keller had cheated them out of. It meant staying in Timber Ridge, making this condemned building livable, standing ground against pressure and threats. The smart play was probably to take the Stokes offer, walk away with profit, start over somewhere else. But he thought about Henry's note, use it to build something that lasts. About a master maltster who'd spent his life pursuing quality over profit, who'd hidden his fortune rather than surrender to people who only saw value in dollars. About the principle that some things were worth standing for even when powerful people wanted to take them. That evening, Richard Stokes returned, this time alone, his posture less aggressive but somehow more dangerous. "My brother gets emotional about this property. Too much family history, too much resentment about how Henry treated our father. But I want to be reasonable with you." "Reasonable how?" $50,000. Final offer. "You take it, we handle the paperwork, you're gone within 2 weeks." Richard met Jack's eyes. "Or you refuse, and you discover what it's like trying to get permits and utilities and building inspections when the people who control those things don't want you here. Your daughters need schools, need doctors, need all the things that come from being accepted in a community. We can make that easy or hard." Jack felt cold clarity settle over him, the same calm he'd felt when Sarah was dying and he'd had to make impossible decisions about treatment and pain management and when to let go. "I'm not selling. This property is legally mine, and whatever it contains belongs to me. You want to make things difficult, do it through proper channels. But understand that I've documented everything, your threats, the trespassing, all of it. Anything happens to me or my daughters, it goes public." Richard's expression went cold. "You're making a mistake. Henry Keller made the same mistake, thought stubbornness was the same as strength. Look where it got him." The implication hung in the air between them, not quite an admission but close enough to be terrifying. Jack stood his ground, forcing himself not to show fear, not to give Richard the satisfaction of knowing the threat had landed. After Richard left, Jack sat with his daughters in their camping space, both girls sensing something had changed, that their father had made a choice that couldn't be unmade. "Are we staying?" Emma asked. "We're staying. Even though it's scary?" Jack pulled them both close. "Especially because it's scary. Your mother taught me something before she died. She said running from hard things just means carrying them with you wherever you go. That sometimes you have to stand for what's right even when it costs you." Grace, ever practical, asked the question that mattered. "But what if the bad men try to hurt us? Then we'll be smart and careful and we'll make sure people know what's happening. But we won't let them take what's ours just because they threaten us." The Malt house stood in the darkness around them, its walls holding secrets that had cost Henry Keller his life, its foundation hiding a fortune that had just become Jack's responsibility to protect. The fight wasn't theoretical anymore. The Stokes family had spent 40 years waiting to claim what they believed was theirs, and they weren't going to let a desperate stranger with 2 young daughters stand in their way. But Jack had nothing left to lose except the ground he stood on, and that ground contained the first real hope he'd had since Sarah died. Henry Keller had trusted whoever found his chamber to use the money to build something lasting. Jack intended to honor that trust, even if it meant fighting battles Henry had died fighting, even if it meant putting himself between his daughters and people who'd been waiting decades for what was sealed in that basement safe. The land kept its secrets, but it had also yielded them to someone who needed them desperately enough to see what others had missed. Now Jack had to prove worthy of that gift, had to stand the ground Henry had held, had to protect what had been entrusted to him against people who believed time and pressure entitled them to take it. The lawsuit arrived 3 weeks after Jack refused the Stokes brothers' final offer, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole thing. Richard and Martin Stokes were suing for ownership of the Malt house, claiming their father Walter had been promised right of first refusal when Henry Keller died, that the property should have been offered to the Stokes family before going to foreclosure auction. The claim was legally dubious but expensive to defend, exactly the kind of pressure designed to make someone without resources surrender rather than fight. Jack sat in the office space he'd made marginally habitable, reading legal documents he could barely understand, calculating costs he couldn't afford. The hidden money gave him resources to hire proper representation, but using it meant revealing he'd found something valuable, which would only confirm the Stokes brothers' suspicions and intensify their efforts to acquire the property. He spent a sleepless night weighing options that all felt wrong in different ways. Fight the lawsuit openly, which meant explaining why he wouldn't sell for reasonable prices, which led to questions about what he'd found. Or fight it quietly, which meant expensive legal battles that could drain Henry's fortune defending the property that contained it. Or worst of all, consider settling, taking a payout and walking away from the first real hope he'd had since Sarah died. Emma found him at dawn still sitting with the lawsuit papers, her face showing concern beyond her years. "You didn't sleep?" "Couldn't. Too much to think about." She sat beside him with the directness that was pure her mother. "We're staying though, right? Even with the lawsuit?" "I want to. But wanting something doesn't make it possible. You told us when we moved here that running from hard things just means carrying them with you. That sometimes you have to stand for what's right even when it costs you." Emma's voice was gentle but firm. "Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The question hit harder than any legal threat, forced Jack to confront whether he'd been teaching his daughters principles he wasn't willing to live by himself. He'd told them about standing ground, about not surrendering to pressure, about the importance of fighting for things that mattered. Now the first real test of those principles was revealing whether he'd meant them or whether they were just comforting words to make poverty feel purposeful. "No," he said finally. "I wasn't lying. We stay. We fight this properly, and we do it in a way that honors what Henry Keller was trying to protect." The lawyer Jack hired was named Patricia Cross, 50-something with the worn competence of someone who'd spent decades practicing in small towns where everyone knew everyone else's business. She reviewed the Stokes lawsuit with the careful attention of someone who understood the real fight wasn't about property law but about power and pressure. "Their claim is weak," Patricia said. right of first refusal has to be in writing to be enforceable, and there's no documentation of any such agreement. But that doesn't mean they can't make this expensive and drawn out. They're betting you can't afford a long legal battle. What if I can afford it? Patricia's expression sharpened. Then they miscalculated. But Jack, if you're planning to use resources to fight this, I need to know where those resources came from. Because if the Stokes brothers find out you discovered something valuable on the property, it changes their motivation and their tactics. Jack made the decision to trust her, explaining about the hidden chamber, Henry's note, the safe full of cash that had been waiting 40 years for someone to find it. Patricia listened without interrupting, her face showing the careful neutrality of someone processing implications faster than most people could follow them. Henry Keller's estate was settled in 1983, she said when Jack finished. All assets were liquidated and distributed according to his will. The money you found wasn't listed in the estate inventory, which means either Henry successfully hid it from his own lawyers and executors, or the personal representative deliberately excluded it. What does that mean legally? It means the money is yours as part of the property transfer. Found assets on legitimately purchased property belong to the new owner unless specifically excluded from the sale. The county had no knowledge of the hidden chamber, so it wasn't excluded. Patricia paused. But here's what worries me. If the Stokes brothers have been searching for this money for 40 years, if they believe they have some moral claim to it, revealing its existence will escalate this from property dispute to something more dangerous. Over the following months, Jack learned more about navigating legal systems than he'd ever wanted to know. Patricia filed motions to dismiss, argued before judges who seemed skeptical that an outsider could be right when facing established local families. The Stokes brothers countered with discovery requests and depositions, fishing for information about why Jack was fighting so hard to keep a property that seemed to have more liabilities than value. But Jack had documentation now, photographs of the hidden chamber taken before touching anything, timestamps proving when he'd found it, Henry's original note left for whoever discovered the safe. More importantly, he had Henry's meticulous ledgers showing decades of honest business practices, tax payments current through 1982, nothing suggesting the money was obtained illegally or hidden to avoid legitimate claims. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dorothy from the county clerk's office mentioned to Patricia that she had a box of papers from the attorney who'd handled Henry's estate, documents that had been stored in her office's archives when the lawyer's practice closed in 1995. Patricia spent a weekend going through dusty files, finding something that changed everything. A letter from Henry Keller to his estate attorney, dated February 1982, 2 months before his death. The letter detailed Henry's decision to liquidate his business assets and convert them to cash, and crucially, stated his intention to keep those personal funds separate from his estate, to be discovered and claimed by whoever acquired the Malt House property in the future. Henry had wanted this, had planned for it, had explicitly instructed his attorney that the hidden chamber and its contents should not be included in his will or estate inventory. "This is ironclad," Patricia said, showing Jack the letter. Henry deliberately separated his personal assets from his business estate. He wanted whoever bought the property to find what he'd hidden. The Stokes family has no claim to it. Armed with this documentation, Patricia filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the lawsuit was baseless and should be dismissed. The hearing was scheduled for early December, and Jack spent the weeks beforehand trying to prepare Emma and Grace for the possibility that they might lose despite being legally right, that small-town judges sometimes favored established families over outsiders regardless of what the law said. The courtroom was smaller than Jack expected, more like a large office than the dramatic spaces he'd seen on television. Judge Morrison was maybe 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime in Timber Ridge and knew everyone involved in this dispute. He reviewed Patricia's motion with careful attention, then listened to the Stokes brothers' attorney argue that moral claims should outweigh technical legal arguments. "My client's father devoted his entire working life to Henry Keller's Malt House," the attorney said. When Mr. Keller liquidated his assets, he did so knowing the Stokes family would be left with nothing. They have a legitimate grievance about how they were treated. "Grievances aren't legal claims," Judge Morrison said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd adjudicated 1,000 small-town disputes. "Do you have documentation showing Walter Stokes was promised ownership or right of first refusal?" "We have testimony from family members who remember conversations, documented promises. In writing." The Stokes attorney had nothing, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge Morrison read through Henry's letter to his estate attorney twice, then looked at Jack with an expression that mixed sympathy and assessment. "Mr. Brennan, you bought this property legally at public auction. The hidden chamber and its contents were part of that property transfer." Henry Keller's own words make clear he intended for those assets to be found and claimed by the property's next owner. Morrison paused. "The Stokes family may feel they have moral claims based on their father's service, but the law deals in documented facts, not feelings." Motion for summary judgment granted. Lawsuit dismissed. After the hearing, Jack stood outside the courthouse with Emma and Grace, feeling relief so profound it was almost physical. Patricia had warned him that winning didn't mean the conflict was over, that the Stokes family could appeal or find other ways to make life difficult. But the legal threat was eliminated, and Jack had documentation proving his right to what he'd found. Richard Stokes approached as they were leaving, his brother Martin hanging back with an expression of bitter defeat. Richard looked older than his 60 years, worn down by decades of fighting for something that had never been his to claim. "You won," Richard said. "Not angry, just tired. The law was on my side." Henry Keller made his intentions clear. "My father worked for that man for 34 years. Gave his whole life to making that malt house successful. He died believing Henry had betrayed him, had promised him something and then hidden assets to keep from honoring that promise." Richard's voice cracked slightly. 40 years I've been trying to get back what I thought was stolen. And now a judge tells me we never had any claim to it." Jack felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for this man who'd spent decades pursuing something based on incomplete information, who'd made an old grievance into his defining purpose. Henry left a letter explaining why he did what he did. "Your father's service was part of what he was trying to protect. Maybe not in the way you expected, but Henry cared about the craft and the people who understood it. Can I read it?" "The letter?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. Some truths were better shared than kept secret, even when they complicated simple narratives about heroes and villains. That evening, Jack showed Richard and Martin the letter Henry had written to his estate attorney, the explanation of why he'd hidden his assets and how he hoped they'd be used. The brothers read it in the office that had been Henry's, surrounded by the equipment and ledgers that documented decades of careful work. "He wanted someone to find it who'd understand the craft mattered," Richard said quietly. "Someone who'd preserve what he built rather than just convert it to cash." "My father could have been that person," Martin said, his voice hard. "If Henry had trusted him, had given him the chance." "Your father never wanted to run the malt house," Richard interrupted. "He told me that himself, years later. Said he was good at the work but didn't have the temperament to manage a business, to make the hard decisions about when to modernize and when to hold to tradition. He loved the craft, but he didn't want the burden of ownership." It was the first time Jack had heard Richard contradict the family narrative, the first suggestion that maybe Walter Stokes's relationship with Henry was more complicated than the simple story of betrayal they'd been telling themselves. Over the winter months, Jack began the slow work of making the malt house truly habitable while preserving its industrial character. He used Henry's money carefully, hiring local contractors, buying materials that would last, investing in proper restoration rather than cheap fixes. The work was methodical and expensive, but watching the building transform from condemned ruin to functional space felt like honoring the trust Henry had placed in whoever found his hidden chamber. Emma and Grace adjusted to their new school in Timber Ridge with the resilience that came from having survived harder transitions. They made friends, found their place in a community that had been suspicious of outsiders but was slowly accepting the family that had bought the old malt house. The money meant Jack could afford the small securities that made childhood stable: regular meals, decent clothes, a bedroom for each girl that felt permanent rather than temporary. But more than the material comfort, what changed was purpose. Jack started researching traditional malting methods, discovering that the craft brewing movement was creating renewed interest in locally sourced, traditionally processed grains. The equipment Henry had left behind could be adapted, the knowledge preserved in his ledgers could be taught, the building itself could become something that honored its history while serving present needs. Richard Stokes became an unexpected ally in this transformation. He started visiting the malt house regularly, sharing stories about his father's work, explaining techniques that existed only in oral tradition because Henry had never written them down. The anger that had driven him for 40 years was fading, replaced by something that looked like relief at finally being able to let go. "My father used to say Henry was the best maltster he'd ever known," Richard said one afternoon while showing Jack how certain equipment was meant to be operated. Said Henry could judge grain quality by touch, could adjust roasting times based on humidity and temperature in ways that seemed like magic but were really just deep understanding of the process. "Would he want this?" Jack asked, gesturing at the restoration work. "Your father, I mean. Would he approve of what I'm building here?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "I think he'd be glad the knowledge isn't dying." That's what really bothered him at the end. Not that he didn't own the business, but that Henry's death meant all that expertise was lost. "If you're bringing it back, teaching people, keeping the craft alive." He trailed off, then finished simply, "Yeah, he'd approve." Spring brought transformation that felt like metaphor. Jack hired specialists to teach him traditional malting, brought in students who wanted to learn methods most commercial operations had abandoned. The malt house floor came alive with the smell of germinating grain, the sound of machinery that had been silent for 40 years, the purpose that came from making something useful rather than just preserving empty space. Emma, at 13 now, showed natural aptitude for the work. She understood instinctively how grain responded to temperature and moisture, could judge when processes were complete in ways that took others years to develop. Jack watched her find confidence in craft, watched her grow into someone who knew what she was good at and valued it. Grace took a different path, more interested in the business and educational aspects, in figuring out how to make the operation sustainable while keeping it accessible to students who couldn't afford expensive tuition. She had her mother's pragmatic intelligence, could see connections between things that Jack missed, could solve problems by finding angles others hadn't considered. They were becoming people shaped by this place, by the choice Jack had made and the work they were building together. Not the people they would have been if Sarah hadn't died or if Jack hadn't lost his job or if desperation hadn't led them to a foreclosure auction. But people nonetheless, with purpose and direction and the understanding that hard things could be survived and sometimes even transformed into meaning. The first harvest came in September. Grain they'd malted themselves using Henry's equipment and traditional methods, sold to craft brewers who valued the quality and the story. The money was modest, nowhere near enough to sustain the operation commercially, but it proved the concept worked, that there was market for what they were building. That evening, after the last delivery had been made and the equipment cleaned for the night, Jack stood on the second-floor catwalk where he'd first found the hidden door. The malt house hummed with a different energy now, no longer abandoned but alive with purpose, its spaces filled with the evidence of work that mattered. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the eviction notice, the desperate auction bid, the hidden chamber that had held more than money. Henry Keller had gambled that someone would come along who'd understand what was worth preserving, who'd use his hidden fortune to build rather than just spend. Jack had proven worthy of that gamble, not by finding the money but by honoring the trust it represented. Patricia Cross visited in October to finalize some remaining legal details from the lawsuit's dismissal. She found Jack in the malting room, monitoring grain that was germinating on the traditional floor Henry had used, maintaining temperature and moisture levels that required constant attention. "You've done something remarkable here," Patricia said, watching the work with evident appreciation. "When you first hired me, I thought this was just a property dispute. I didn't realize you were planning to resurrect a dying craft." "I wasn't planning anything. Just trying to honor what Henry left behind, use his money the way he hoped it would be used. You've done more than that. You've created something that matters to this community, given people a way to connect with heritage they'd forgotten existed." Patricia handed him an envelope. This came from the State Historical Society. They're offering a grant for traditional craft preservation. Richard Stokes nominated you. Jack opened the envelope, finding a letter offering $50,000 to expand the teaching programs, to document traditional malting methods before they were completely lost. The money would allow him to hire more instructors, accept more students, ensure the knowledge Henry had protected would survive another generation. That night, he read the grant letter to Emma and Grace, all of them sitting in the living space they'd created from what had been Henry's administrative offices. The room had walls now, had heat and running water, had the feeling of home rather than desperate shelter. Outside, the Malt house stood solid against the autumn darkness, its windows glowing warm, its purpose renewed. "Mr. Keller would be proud," Emma said. "You think so?" "He hid his money hoping someone would use it to keep what he built alive. You're doing that. More than that, you're making it grow." She paused. "Mom would be proud too. Of how you didn't give up when things got hard, how you built something good from what looked like nothing." Jack felt his throat tighten at the mention of Sarah, at the reminder that she'd been gone 4 years now, that Emma and Grace were growing up without their mother but were somehow still becoming remarkable people. "Your mom taught me that running from hard things doesn't solve anything. That sometimes you have to stand and fight even when you're scared. And you taught us the same thing," Grace added. "By doing it. By staying here when the Stokes brothers threatened us, by fighting the lawsuit, by building all this instead of just taking easy money and leaving." The Malt house breathed around them, its brick walls holding stories that spanned generations, its spaces transformed from abandonment to purpose through work and vision and the stubborn refusal to let important things die. Henry Keller had died protecting what he'd built, had hidden his fortune as a final act of faith that someone would come along who'd understand what mattered. Jack had been that someone, had arrived desperate and broken, had found more than money in the hidden chamber. He'd found purpose that extended beyond survival, found meaning in preserving knowledge most people had forgotten, found a way to transform his daughter's childhood tragedy into foundation for lives built on craft and quality and the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. The land had kept its secrets, the Clearwater River flowing past as it always had, the soil remembering everything that happened here. But it had yielded what mattered most, the chance to build something meaningful, the opportunity to prove worthy of trust placed by a man who'd died before they met, the understanding that legacy was something you built rather than something you received. As winter approached and the teaching season wound down, Jack stood in the malting room that had been silent for 40 years, running his hands over equipment Henry Keller had maintained with meticulous care, feeling the continuity between that life and his own. The money had bought them security and breathing room, but the real treasure was understanding what was worth fighting for, what was worth preserving, what was worth building even when the easier path was walking away. The Malt house would stand, would teach, would preserve knowledge that connected present craft to centuries of tradition. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in grain and time, in patient work and stubborn refusal to let important things disappear, in the understanding that sometimes desperate people stumbling into good fortune used it to build something that mattered beyond their own salvation. 15 years passed like grain through a mill, each season leaving its mark on the Malt house the way time shapes all things that endure. Jack watched Emma and Grace grow from 7-year-old girls who'd camped in a condemned building to 22-year-old women whose lives had been shaped by the choice he'd made that desperate autumn. The transformation wasn't dramatic in the daily living of it, but when Jack looked at photographs from those first weeks, scared children sleeping in a corner office, himself gaunt with worry, he barely recognized the people they'd been. The Malt house had transformed with them. What had been industrial decay was now purposeful preservation, what had been abandonment was now education. The main malting floor operated again, not for commercial production but as a teaching facility where people learned traditional grain processing methods most of the world had forgotten. The craft brewing renaissance had created demand for knowledge Henry Keller had practiced, and Jack had used the hidden fortune to build something that honored that expertise. The environmental cleanup had consumed nearly half of Henry's money over the first 3 years. Jack had hired specialists who'd removed asbestos methodically, had treated lead paint properly, had brought the building up to modern safety standards while preserving its industrial character. The work had been expensive and slow, but watching the malt house shed its toxic legacy had felt like participating in redemption larger than himself. Emma had become a master brewer at 21, certified after years of studying both traditional methods and modern science. She ran the teaching program that operated from the malt house, educating craft brewers who wanted to understand how quality malt was made before industrial processes standardized everything. Her passion for the craft had emerged naturally from growing up surrounded by it, from understanding that the building she'd called home represented knowledge worth preserving. Grace had taken a different path, studying environmental science and historic preservation, focusing on how to save industrial buildings without erasing their purpose. She consulted with communities across the region, helping them see abandoned structures not as liabilities but as opportunities to preserve knowledge while adapting to present needs. Her master's thesis had been about the malt house itself, about how one building's resurrection could demonstrate that heritage and utility weren't opposites. Jack had found his own rhythm over those years. He managed the malt house's operations, handled finances that allowed them to run sustainably while keeping programs accessible. He'd remarried 5 years ago to Claire, a woman who taught history at the local college and who understood that some people carried grief that never fully healed but could learn to live alongside it. She'd helped him see that honoring Sarah's memory meant building the kind of life she would have wanted for their daughters, not remaining frozen in the moment she'd died. The remainder of Henry's fortune had been invested with the same care Henry had shown his craft. Scholarships for students who couldn't afford tuition, grants for other historic preservation projects, reserves for building maintenance that ensured the malt house would stand for generations. The money had bought them security, but its real value was the breathing room it provided to build something meaningful rather than just survive. On a warm evening in late summer, 20 years after Jack had bought the malt house at auction, they held what had become an annual tradition. The Keller Memorial Gathering, a day when the facility opened to the community, when brewers demonstrated traditional techniques, when the building celebrated not just its survival but its purpose renewed. Richard Stokes attended, as he had for the past 8 years, his presence no longer tense but accepted. He was 78 now, his brother Martin having died 3 years earlier without ever making peace with the fact that the Stokes family would never own what they'd spent 2 generations believing was rightfully theirs. Richard's transformation had been gradual, born from watching what Jack built and recognizing that some battles weren't worth the cost of winning. Henry would have appreciated this, Richard said, watching Emma teach a workshop on traditional floor malting. Not because you're making money from it, but because you're keeping alive what he died trying to protect. Jack had learned over the years that Richard's obsession with the malt house had been about more than property. It had been about his father's devotion to Henry Keller, about working a lifetime for someone who'd never shown gratitude, about feeling entitled to inherit what had been built with Stokes' family labor. Breaking that cycle had freed something in Richard, had allowed him to see the building not as something stolen but as heritage preserved. Your father was Henry's foreman for how long? Jack asked, knowing the answer but wanting Richard to tell it. 34 years. Started when he was 18, worked until the day Henry closed the operation without warning. Richard's voice carried old pain, but the anger had faded. My father believed Henry would leave him the business, or at least sell it to him at fair price. Instead, Henry sealed up that basement, hid his money, and died without telling anyone where it was. Left my father with nothing but years of loyalty that hadn't mattered. I found something you should see, Jack said, leading Richard to the small museum space they'd created in Henry's old office. He pulled out a ledger from 1982, one he'd discovered years ago but hadn't shown Richard until now. Read the entry from March 1st. Richard took the ledger carefully, finding the page Jack indicated. Henry's precise handwriting documented a payment, final settlement to Walter Stokes, 40 years loyal service. Pension fund established, details with attorney Morris. Henry set up a pension for your father? Richard's voice was quiet. I found the attorney's records when settling the estate issues. Your father was supposed to receive monthly payments for life, but he died 6 months after Henry, and the attorney handling it passed away the same year. The pension fund sat unclaimed, nobody knew about it except Henry and the lawyer. Jack paused. The fund still exists, has been accumulating interest for 40 years. It's worth about $200,000 now, and legally it belongs to Walter Stokes's heirs. That would be you and Martin's estate. Richard stood holding the ledger, his eyes showing the complicated math of a man recalculating 40 years of resentment based on new information. Henry provided for my father. My father died believing he'd been cast aside, but Henry had taken care of him. And you spent 40 years fighting to take what you thought had been stolen, when actually Henry had honored your father's service. Jack's voice was gentle. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty. I'm telling you because understanding the truth matters more than protecting old grievances. After Richard left to process this revelation, Jack stood in the office that had once been Henry's, looking out at the malting floor where students were learning techniques that connected them to centuries of tradition. The building hummed with purpose, alive in ways it hadn't been since Henry's death, serving a function that honored what he'd built while adapting to present needs. Dorothy from the county clerk's office had passed away 8 years ago, but not before telling Jack more about Henry's final days. The master maltster had known he was dying, heart disease that doctors said was terminal, and had spent his last months preparing the chamber, converting assets to cash, creating the puzzle that would test whoever found it. His death hadn't been mysterious murder as some believed, but a heart attack that claimed him while he was still working, still tending to details, still committed to quality until the end. The truth was simpler and sadder than the legends that had accumulated. Henry had died alone doing what he'd always done, had sealed away his fortune because he couldn't bear the thought of it being divided by distant relatives who'd never understood the craft that defined his life. He'd gambled that someone desperate enough to buy a foreclosed malt house would be thorough enough to find what he'd hidden, would be worthy enough to honor the trust he placed in them. Emma found Jack in the office an hour later, her face showing the thoughtful expression she wore when processing something important. Mrs. Chin from our old elementary school called. She wanted to know if we'd come speak to her class about perseverance in making something from nothing. Jack smiled at the memory of the field trip money he couldn't afford, of Emma asking for $20 he didn't have. What did you tell her? That we'd be honored. Grace wants to talk about adaptive reuse of historic buildings, and I want to explain how beer connects to agriculture and tradition. She paused. It's strange thinking about who we were then, camping in this building with nothing, and who we are now. Strange good or strange unsettling? Both. Mom dying broke us in ways I'm still discovering. But finding this place, finding Mr. Keller's treasure, it gave us something to build from. Not just the money, but the purpose. The understanding that some things are worth fighting for even when powerful people want to take them. That evening, after the gathering had ended and the last visitors had left, Jack walked the property's perimeter as he did most nights, checking fence lines and building systems, ensuring everything was secure. The hop vine where Henry had buried the key still climbed its trellis, older and thicker but still vital. The Clearwater River flowed past as it had for millennia, indifferent to human claims and conflicts, witnessing the slow work of buildings being restored and knowledge being preserved. Claire joined him at the river's edge, her hand finding his, both of them comfortable in the silence that came from years together. She'd helped him see that Henry's legacy wasn't just the money or the building, but the principle that craft and quality mattered even when the world moved toward cheaper alternatives. Richard looked different today, she said. Less burdened. I told him about his father's pension fund. About how Henry had provided for Walter Stokes, how 40 years of anger was based on incomplete information. How did he take it? Like a man who'd been carrying something heavy and finally found a place to set it down. Jack watched the river flow, thinking about how truth had a way of surfacing eventually, how secrets kept too long became poison. The Stokes family spent 2 generations fighting over something they'd convinced themselves they'd been cheated out of. But Henry had honored Walter's service, had made provision. They just never knew. Over the following year, Richard became a regular presence at the Malt house, not as someone trying to claim it but as someone preserving his father's memory. He donated Walter's old tools and work records to the museum, shared stories about traditional malting techniques his father had taught him as a boy, helped Emma understand nuances of the craft that existed only in oral tradition. The reconciliation happened gradually, naturally, born from understanding that both Henry and Walter had been complicated men doing their best with the information and circumstances they had. The feud that had poisoned 2 generations ended not with dramatic confrontation but with quiet recognition that the truth was more complex than anyone's simplified version. Emma graduated with her master brewer certification, establishing herself as an expert in traditional malting methods. Grace completed her doctorate, her research focusing on how preserving industrial knowledge created economic opportunities while maintaining cultural continuity. Both women had been shaped by the Malt House, by understanding that their childhood desperation had led them to something worth building. Jack stood at Henry Keller's grave one autumn afternoon, 25 years after buying the Malt House, looking at a stone that simply read Master Maltster, 1918 to 1982. Someone had left fresh flowers, probably one of the students who'd learned from the programs Henry's hidden fortune had funded. The old master had died alone and secretive, but his knowledge lived on through people who'd never met him, who learned from techniques he'd perfected and protected. "I used your money the way you hoped," Jack said to the stone, feeling only slightly foolish talking to someone 2 decades dead. "Built something that lasts, kept the knowledge alive, honored the craft you believed mattered. The Stokes family made peace with your memory. Your building teaches instead of rotting. You'd probably find fault with how we do some things, but I think you'd recognize the principles." On a warm evening in early summer, 30 years after Jack had arrived in Timber Ridge with Emma and Grace and nothing else, they held a different kind of celebration. Emma's wedding, held on the Malt House grounds that had become her home and her calling. She married another brewer, someone who understood that their life would always involve grain and yeast and the patient work of creating quality. Jack walked his daughter down an aisle arranged between the grain bins, past students and colleagues and community members who'd watched her grow up in this building. Grace stood as maid of honor, her own life settled in a career that connected preservation to progress, that helped other communities save what deserved saving. As Emma spoke her vows in the space where Henry Keller had spent 50 years perfecting his craft, Jack felt the weight of 30 years settle into something approaching completion. Not ending, because the work continued, but closure on the journey that had started with an eviction notice and a desperate auction bid. The Malt House stood solid in the evening light, its brick walls holding stories that spanned generations, its spaces filled with celebration and purpose. The building that had nearly been demolished, that had sat abandoned for 40 years, had been reborn through desperation meeting opportunity, through one man's hidden fortune meeting another man's willingness to honor the trust it represented. Richard Stokes attended the wedding, now in his 80s, his face showing the peace that came from released burdens. He'd written a book the previous year about his father's work, about Walter Stokes's contributions to traditional malting, about how family legends were often simpler than the stories people told themselves. The Stokes family legacy was no longer defined by what they'd failed to acquire, but by the knowledge Walter had preserved and passed forward. As evening settled over Timber Ridge and the celebration continued, Jack stood with Claire watching their daughters, one married now, one finishing her doctorate, both women who'd been shaped by the choice he'd made 30 years ago. The Malt House had saved them from homelessness, but more importantly, it had given them purpose that transcended survival. The land kept its secrets still, the river flowing past as it had for ages, the soil remembering everything that had happened here. But it had yielded what mattered most, the opportunity to build something meaningful, the chance to honor a trust placed in someone desperate enough to see what others had missed, brave enough to fight for what was found. Henry Keller had gambled that hiding his fortune would protect it until someone worthy appeared. That gamble had paid off in ways Henry couldn't have anticipated, had created continuity that transformed individual struggle into community resource, had proven that some inheritances came with obligations that extended beyond personal benefit. Jack thought about the journey, the eviction notice, the auction, the hidden chamber, the threats and pressure, the choice to stand rather than surrender. He thought about Emma and Grace growing up in this building, about the students who'd learned traditional methods here, about Richard Stokes finding peace with history he couldn't change. The Malt House would stand long after everyone currently alive was gone, would continue teaching and preserving, would honor Henry Keller's devotion to craft and quality. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you own but what you built, not what you inherited but what you chose to protect and pass forward. As stars appeared in patterns that had witnessed this land before humans claimed it, Jack felt gratitude for the desperation that had led him here, for the courage to open a hidden safe, for the stubbornness to stand ground when powerful people demanded surrender. Henry's fortune had bought them security, but his real gift was understanding that some things were worth protecting even when the world had moved on. The building breathed in the darkness, its purpose renewed, its toxic legacy cleaned away, its knowledge preserved and multiplied across generations. Henry had died protecting what he'd built, had hidden his fortune as final act of faith. Jack had honored that faith, had used what was found to create something that mattered beyond personal salvation. The Malt house stood as proof that what was worth defending could be defended, that heritage survived through choice and commitment, that sometimes desperate gambles made by broken people led to places worth reaching. The land had held its secrets, had yielded them to someone worthy, and Jack had proven worthy not just by finding them but by honoring the trust they represented. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.